Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
You know, if you've listened to the show in the past, you know I'm not a big fan of fighting. It bothers me that many of my colleagues encourage the idea that it isn't whether you fight, but how that matters most. And I'm going to agree that all the strategies given about fighting fair are right. They're right on. But my issue is with the concept of fighting at all. But to be honest, I live in the real world, and couples not only disagree, they often fight. And quite frankly, I'm not any different. My husband and I have fought. Not often, but it's happened. And the problem was damage was caused. And one of the most overlooked aspects of fighting with our partners is how to move past it. And since most marriages are a cycle of connection and disconnection, and fighting falls into that category, it's critically important to know how to engage in the third part of the cycle, which is repair. So to talk about how to do this, I'm joined by intentionally intimate coach, I love that title, Kyle Benson. Kyle, thanks so much for coming back on the show and talking about something that I think will really help a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah. So you wrote an article for the Gottman Institute blog, which, by the way, people, if you ever want great information, go to the Gottman Institute blog, called How We Use the Aftermath of a Fight to Repair Our Relationship. And in this article, which I love, it starts talking about fighting over the cat's litter box, which I think is great. You mentioned the research that shows that it's not what you fight about, but how you repair that matters. So what is this research and what makes it important?
Yeah, so this research, one of the things and the reason I'm associated with the Gottman Institute or was able to publish that is I actually work in a love lab, and this love lab was restarted a few years ago. But if this research that I'm talking about, if we go back about 20, 30 years, Dr. John Gottman, who helped kind of start the Gottman Institute with his wife, Julie Gottman. John started doing this research where he put couples into an apartment and just observed their interactions.
Ooh.
And so he hooked them up to heart rate monitors, and he just literally watched their micro expressions, how they interacted, the way they responded, how they made bids for connection. And he took all that information and started to get an idea of how a relationship functions. And then his question was, well, how do couples fight? You know, what happens at that point? And what differentiates the masters of marriage versus the disasters? And so what he did is and we do this in the Love Lab today, is we have these couples come in. We hook up wires to their face, to their body. We're measuring their heart rate, their skin conductivity, their facial expressions. And we sit them in these chairs where they're facing each other, and we have cameras on them. And we hand them these sheets of paper and we say, okay, what is one of the bigger problems in your marriage? And we get them kind of talking about what that is. And then the therapist who is kind of doing this walks out the room. And we let them deal with this conflict for about 15 minutes. And we just watch how they deal with it. And one of the things we've noticed is that in couples, they, outside of the Love Lab, they'll get in fights. Or they'll hurt each other, or they'll say things that they later regret. And so, conflict, as we discovered, is inevitable. But the key thing is learning actually how to repair when things go wrong. And John and Julie often say this too, is like they're not perfect. They sometimes criticize each other even though they built all this stuff, and it just happens. And so they've had to learn that, yes, we can be mindful to try to be preventative, but we're not perfect. And so what happens when we take a wrong step or we say something that our partner takes as mean or hurtful? How do we repair? And that's actually one of the most important aspects, because as you talked about, like that disconnection to connection, right? A conflict really disconnects us, but it also offers us the opportunity to learn about each other and to repair our relationship and actually make it stronger. And so that's really what the research highlights is when we watch these masters, one of the things they did is they would make repair attempts. And these repair attempts would really improve and de-escalate the conflict. It'd reconnect them as partners. And then it made it easier for them to work through the problem. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's good to know that the Gottmans sometimes disagree too. That gives hope for the rest of us.
Yes, yeah.
And it's really because a lot of times my clients will look at me. It's like, oh yes, I am not perfect either. I've been there, done that, know exactly what you guys are going through. Because we're all human. We all are subject to being hurt, to saying hurtful things, and it's so important to know that there's a way back.
Yes, yes. And this is such an interesting thing because one of the things I ask couples that I work with is I'll say, when was your first experience or when was the last experience you had when you watched someone repair their relationship after a conflict? And for a lot of people, they're kind of like, I don't know.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. Right. They don't have that experience. They weren't a witness of that, or they didn't have that experience in their own relationships. And so it's a very foreign thing. And that's what I love kind of about this exercise you and I are going to talk about called the aftermath of a fight, is because it walks you through steps on actually how to do that step by step.
Okay.
And so
now,
yeah.
So now that you mention that, because you do talk about this, and in your article, you actually have the question. So, what is this thing that you call the aftermath of a fight exercise?
Yeah. So it's an intervention. So that's where it started. It's this intervention that John and Julie created to use with couples who came to them for couples therapy. And what they did is they then took that intervention and turned it into kind of a pretty usable, friendly booklet that they actually have on their website or in most of their books. And it goes through these different steps on how to repair after you have a conflict that kind of blows up. And it walks you through these steps, step by step, so you can actually get to the heart of what happened, understand each other better, and start to repair your relationship.
So the first part of this is a series of questions that we kind of need to ask ourselves. And what are some of those questions?
Well, I think the first thing, and these questions that you're initially looking at, these actually aren't in the aftermath, but this is just getting into, are you ready to have this conversation? Because sometimes, people are not ready, or they're too bitter, or they're in a mind where their thoughts are really negative, and they're just, really beating their partner up in their thoughts and ruminating on that. And then they go to try to talk about this issue, and that hostility.
And then they just start round two.
Right, exactly. And so these questions, what they do is they get you to reflect and really ask you, are you ready to actually repair and work through this conflict? And because to sit down and work through it, you have to be in an emotional space where you can do that. Because if you're overwhelmed, if you're frustrated, if you're still pissed off, you go to sit down and talk about this, those emotions can hijack this from working, and then just like you said, you have round two again.
Or so 5 or 10 or whatever the round it happens to be on this particular thing.
Exactly.
Well, and that goes along with what I talk about that the timing of conversations is critically important. And so these questions are kind of a way to judge whether the timing, I'm not sure there's ever an optimal timing, but there's certainly poor timing, and still being upset is an indicator of don't open your mouth.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, if my partner and I, if we try to repair this as I'm driving down the freeway after 7 hours of driving in the car, it's probably not going to go well. But if we have eaten food, if we feel well rested, if we feel emotionally calm, we're going to be in a much better place to engage each other, talk about these things openly, and actually work closer to a solution. And so these questions that I have in this article, they go through checking yourself. How calm have you been lately? Are you ready to actually have this conversation? And then it talks about checking your environment. can you actually sit down for a good 30 minutes to an hour and really focus on your partner without distractions, without the phone going off, without the kids running in, without the dinner things going off, and then kind of checking with your partner, are they ready to do this? And having that as like a pre-step to even starting this exercise often really makes it much more effective and beneficial for the couple before they even start to dive into the actual steps of the aftermath of a fight.
Right, and there are three, because you have 6 questions listed in the article, and 3 of them are kind of about you. Where are you, or are you? Can you be, distraction free? Can you focus on each other? But there are a couple of them that are really important, and I'm looking at number 3, which is, am I willing to seek to understand my partner's experience? In other words, don't focus on the facts, because there are so many times in my office where somebody will say, well, you said this, and the other one says, no, I didn't. And, they get into the quote-unquote facts, which, one, aren't usually the issue anyway, and they're not really facts either, because we don't necessarily hear exactly what the other person said. So I usually tell my clients, it's like, unless you have a video recording or an audio recording where an objective third person can say, yes, this is exactly the words that were used, you're going to have a secondary argument about that.
Right, and I think that's one of the big problems is people get stuck in trying to fight for who's right. And when you fight for who's right, your relationship loses. And the reality is, if we look at psychology and the research behind how the brain works, right, our brain is not seeing reality as reality, right? It's filtered through our perception, through our past experiences, through the meaning we make of what's going on. And I had a couple recently where they were debating on when the conflict happened was whether that partner just walked in that door, or if the partner had been home for half an hour. And I told them, I was like, does this actually matter? Does it matter?
Yeah, that was the question that went through my head, is why does it matter? It's the same thing. It happened on Tuesday. No, it happened on Sunday. It's like, what does that have to do with anything?
Right. But that's, again, right, this need to be right, this need to feel like, well, my experience is validated. But the problem is that blocks us from actually getting your experience validated. Because when you take this other stance of that there's 2 experiences and they're both valid, you can stop fighting over who's right and start to seek to understand what was your partner's experience, and then let them into your experience without debating what actually happened, right? Because what I experienced in this conflict with my partner was much different than what she experienced, right? She's complaining about, do you want to go into that now, or do you want me to hold up?
So we'll just why don't we hold on to that, because I need to remind people that This Is Happily Ever After is just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm having a really important conversation with intentionally intimate coach Kyle Benson about how to recover after you've had a fight with your partner. And so if this is an area of your relationship that you want to improve, I'm going to tell you, you're not alone. Because you're listening to the show, you're learning how to do this. And while the steps may be simple in concept, they aren't necessarily easy to implement. So if you would like some guidance with this process, I encourage you to not put it off. Give me a call or send me an email and schedule your free, no obligation, Create Your Happily Ever After transformation session. You can reach me at Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnc.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. Or you can give me a call at area code 919-924-0463. Again, that's 919-924-0463. And now I want to get back to talking with Kyle about how to implement some of these actual steps. And again, the steps in the fighting, the aftermath of the fighting exercise, there are 5, and I want to break them into 2 categories. 3 that are about you, and 2 that involve your partner. And so when we're part of a couple, I like to say we've got a built-in scapegoat, but looking at our own role in the fight is really critical. So can you talk more about the 3, which is expressing how you felt about the fight, disclosing your triggers, and then taking ownership of your role.
Yeah, it's really important, right? Because it's so easy, just as you said, to blame our partners and kind of look at, well, you caused these feelings, so it's really your fault, right? You
made me mad.
Right. You're the problem. When the reality is that's kind of a defense mechanism, and that's just because you're really hurting. And the problem is, if you take that approach, you make it nearly impossible to actually solve the problem and improve your relationship, because you're so focused on what's wrong with your partner that you don't actually let them see how you're hurting. And that's what these next steps are, is to create a space where you can start to slow down, get in touch with your, step one, your feelings. What actually happened for you? What were you feeling? Were you feeling defensive? Were you feeling hurt? Were you feeling angry? Were you feeling that you had no influence or you're powerless? Right? Really stepping into what those things are. And in this aftermath of a fight guide, the first thing you need to do is just list these feelings. Not put any reason behind them, not kind of say, well, I felt frustrated because you did this, but just list out the different feelings. I felt sad, I felt frustrated, I felt like you didn't even like me, things like that, and then have your partner do the same thing. And what that does is that slows down the conflicts and get you to recognize what actually each of you were feeling before this thing as this thing started ramping up and escalating. And then step two, you actually take turns as a speaker and a listener, where one person says, okay, I'm going to talk about this event, focusing on my own perceptions, what I witnessed, what my brain made up, and kind of what I'm needing to make this better. One of the things that's really tough about this is, as one partner is talking, especially the speaker, the listener has a really hard time listening. And so one of the things I really want to encourage you to do is to have a dialogue, not two monologues. And so it's so easy for the listener to be hearing what your partner is saying, but in your head being like, well, no, that's not true, or what about this? I really want you to, and so one of the things I had to do is, you go ahead.
I talk about when a lot of times when we're having what we think is a dialogue, we're actually only listening enough to kind of validate our position, and then we're coming up with how we're going to counteract what the other person is saying, not actually just sitting and letting them share what it was like for them. And I think that's a defensive response, because we feel like that's an inaccurate portrayal, because we know what's going on in our head, but that isn't necessarily how our partners experience it.
Right, and exactly. I mean, of course you're going to feel defensive. And one of the things when I'm working with couples doing this exact exercise is I tell that listener, I said, look, I promise you will get your time to share, but I really want you to put your agenda, your defensiveness, and put it on hold, and really focus on the words your partner says, really focus on the things they made up about this and the feelings they had about this, and really try to listen as you're trying to understand what their experience was. And then to make sure that you understand what that experience was, is you're going to actually summarize what you heard and say it back to them, and make sure that you got it right. Because often in communication, we miss a lot of things because we're not checking in with each other. And so I have them ask, okay, I heard you say this. I heard that your experience was this. Did I get that right? And if that partner says yes, then we move to kind of that next step. But often it's, you got this part right, and there's this other part I really need you to understand. And so that's really, really important. Do you have something to say on that?
Right. That's what I talk about when I talk about communication, that reflective listening, which most of the time we don't do this. And this is where assumptions come in, because, I know what my partner is feeling, thinking. It's like, no, I actually have to listen to them, and I have to be able to say it back to them to make sure that I got it. Because often we think we do have it, but we don't. And that's, like you said, we have part of it, not all of it.
Right, and that's the trap, right, is we assume that we got it, but we don't check in with our partners, and then we miss key information that could actually make us understand what actually happened better and actually get us closer to a resolution. And so that's why it's really important to have that reflective listener and really take a full-on speaker role where you're actually listening to your partner, you summarize what they say, and then you get to a place where you can, maybe you don't agree with their experience, but at least you can validate their experience and say, you know what, when I stand in your shoes or I see things from your point of view, it makes perfect sense why you felt that way or how you saw it.
Okay.
And even go ahead.
So that's the step that is a mutual step about sharing your realities and validating each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what about this disclosing of your triggers? Again, now, because I know this sounds like it's a great idea, but I know a lot of people are going, I can't do that, or I don't even know what they are. So what is disclosing your triggers?
So that's the next step. After you both feel understood about kind of your each experiences, then we take it another level, right? And so creating that understanding creates safety for us to start to explore, what are these triggers? What did this event mean to you? What actually escalated the interaction for you? And so, often when I'm working with couples is like, what was the story your mind made up, or what was the thing that you felt about? And so in this instance for my partner, right, when she replayed the event and her experience of it, she felt triggered because of what was going on with our cat. She's had this cat in her life for 15 years, and now the cat is really struggling. And that's really hard, but that's also compounded by the difficulty that her dad has had Parkinson's disease since she was born. And she's had to be a caretaker for him. And she's been kind of left alone to kind of deal with that because her mom and her brother are on the other side of the country. And that's been really hard for her. And so these feelings of being abandoned, of being alone and having no one to kind of support her really came up. And so that was a really big trigger that underneath all the feelings, underneath her experiences, that was the deep stuff that made this small issue a big issue in her eyes and in her experience.
And that's what I think people need to understand is that we don't get that. I mean, no, we might get a little annoyed or a little frustrated, but we don't get truly, truly upset unless it's really hitting us deep. And I know that one of my triggers is being treated like I'm stupid, like I'm incompetent, because that came from my childhood, and so the fights that my husband and I have had have usually been over some version of I'm thinking he thinks I'm stupid, which when I'm calm, I know he doesn't, but I immediately go back to being 6 years old.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's so important to understand is, Sue Johnson, who talks about attachment theory in this, she calls that emotional sensitivity a raw spot. And it's almost like, I kind of almost relate it to like a rug burn, right? You have a rug burn on your elbow or something. It's fine until all of a sudden something brushes up against it. And even if it brushes up against it really lightly, your initial reaction is to jump back to it because it hurts, because it's so sensitive. And that's exactly what this is emotionally for a lot of people is when that trigger gets touched, it literally feels like everything just becomes inflamed, and it really hurts. And our partner who might not understand that trigger might be taken aback on how upset or how you're responding to the situation. So doing this step kind of really goes deeper into the triggers and really helps you understand your partner in a really deep way.
So then what's the next step? Is the next step taking ownership of your role?
Yes. So the next step is really taking responsibility. And this is to acknowledge kind of your role in the miscommunication and kind of what happened and what escalated. And so in this exercise, the first thing you really do is like, what set you up for miscommunication? And like for me, one of the reasons I was more reactive is I had been really stressed. I had been a little bit distant. I had been a little bit burnt out because I've been planning a big conference. I have been working more hours than usual. And so I had a lot lower tolerance to engage in a conflict or really understand my partner in that moment. And so that kind of really set me up for miscommunication. And my partner had her own things that was going on with her own stressors. She was running late for work. And so these other things that kind of set her up. But then, acknowledging that and then getting to the place where you actually start to apologize. I was really, really sad that, and I told my partner that I responded in such a defensive way because I didn't actually engage or see how she was hurting about this issue. And she was really apologetic that she was that she attacked me and that she said the things she did. And being able to apologize about these things is so important to being able to move beyond it.
Right, and that seems to be a place where a lot of people get stuck because and I think that all of this, but especially this taking ownership of our own role, is not coming at it from a place of blame or judgment, but more of a place of acknowledgement. And I think that that's a really critical thing, especially when we're thinking about apologizing, because I think a lot of people get really spun out. Well, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, well, that's again putting it into terms of right and wrong, which is rarely ever effective, unless, of course, we're talking about 2 + 2 = 4, and then yes, there is a right or wrong answer to that one. But most of what goes on in an argument or a disagreement is they're not fact-based, and nobody's right, nobody's wrong, or in some cases both people are right. I tell people, if you can come to different conclusions but coming from the same set of facts, that both opinions are equally valid. I keep telling people it's like the moon is not made of green cheese. I don't care how many people say so. That's not that's not a fact. But it's how do we get past this idea that somehow apologizing means I was wrong. It just means I contributed to this unpleasant, uncomfortable situation, and I'm sorry.
Right. Well, and I think this is what makes it so hard, is to admit you're wrong kind of almost admits that you're a bad partner, right? It becomes so much bigger than it actually is. You can't make a mistake. You can't unintentionally hurt your partner. And one of the things I've been talking a lot with couples more recently is your intention might not have been to hurt your partner, but the impact on your partner is it did hurt them. And so your goal is not to become defensive and try to say, well, that wasn't my intent, because that dismisses the impact. What your goal is first to help comfort them in the impact of it, understand how it impacts them, and create that safety for them to feel understood, and then give them the space to understand that your intent was not that, and that it was just a miscommunication error. It was something that just didn't go well. And that's really hard for some people.
It is because this is when we come out with, oh, well, that shouldn't bother you. Oh, please don't do that. It's like, it did. Now, whether it should or shouldn't is a complete, that's a judgmental statement. It did bother me, and here's why. And I think that's really the critical piece of knowing what our own triggers are so that we can disclose them to our partners. And again, that can be really scary because we're providing our partners with information about how to hurt us. And my attitude is that good partners won't ever use that intentionally against you. And if somebody's doing that, then you might have bigger problems than just a simple disagreement. And
yes.
So we take ownership of our role. Each person takes ownership of their role, which sounds like is, even though all of this is part of the repair process, that may actually be, if I were just kind of like sitting behind the two-way mirror, would be like, here comes the repair effort. Here comes the invitation to actually come back together.
Right. It's the metaphor I kind of use, it's kind of like building a bridge, right? The first 4 steps are putting the bricks and getting all the material, or the first 3 steps. And then that fourth and 5th step is starting to actually build the bridge back towards each other. And that's really what this is. It's really taking responsibility. It's putting the bricks in a row so you can start to get reconnected with your partner and repair your relationship.
So the last step is something called preventive planning, which sounds really good. It also sounds a little complicated. So how do people do this?
Yeah, so now that you have information of the feelings that were around this event, kind of the unique experiences of your partner and yourself, the triggers that underline it, you now can go and start to think, well, what can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? Or what can we do that if this happens again or this thing happens again, what can we do differently? All right. And so, like, for instance, with my partner, like, because I had been so stressed out, because I had so much going on, her and I hadn't been in the habit of talking about our stresses or opening up as much lately because we had both been so busy. And so we agreed that, you know, if we get back in the habit of talking about our stresses with each other, this incident likely wouldn't have happened. And so that's an example of being preventative. Another thing that, you know, constructive plans is like, okay, if we start this again, if we start to feel like this trigger is touched again, what's a phrase we could say that would let us both know that we're now heading down a negative spiral and we need to stop, repair, reconnect, and change how we're talking to each other. So it's kind of stuff like that where you're just kind of going like, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again or this doesn't get worse next time it comes up?
Right, because it will come up. Maybe not this particular thing, but something like it, because it's sort of like the frog in the pot of boiling water. We don't necessarily fully comprehend what's happening until something like this goes on, and then you guys realize, oh, we hadn't been sharing. Because I would say this to my kids. If I hadn't slept well, I would tell them, guys, Mom got 3 hours of sleep last night. Proceed with caution, because I was warning them. I don't have the bandwidth of patience that, you know, I would have if I were well rested. And so it wasn't to give me an excuse. It was just to let them know, hey, I just need to let you know I'm not in a great place today. Same thing, you know, if they were sick, you know, they wouldn't be at their best. You know, these things that happen all the time, there are ways to be proactive about it, and that's what this step is.
Yeah, and I think what I love about kind of what you're telling your kids that is they now, instead of assuming that you're always this mean person, they actually have something to explain. Oh, you know what, she's just really grumpy right now because she hasn't slept, and that makes sense to me. And that's a really helpful preventative thing to do, to make sure you and your partner or your kids in this case are on the same page about how you're feeling emotionally in the day, you know, that you might be a little bit more sensitive or a little bit more stressed out than normal because of other things that are happening. And that's kind of what this whole exercise helps us do, is it helps us understand, you know, what all influenced this conflict to really escalate. Right.
Which is one of the ways to make them happen less frequently.
Yes, exactly.
So Kyle, where can people find this article and other great information that you have about improving their relationships?
So there's two great resources. The first one is my personal blog, kylebenson.net. I have about 150 articles there. But then there's also the Gottman Institute, who you mentioned earlier. And I've written, I think, like 60-plus articles for them, and they have close to 500 articles and really cool things that are organized in a way that you can start to get a clear understanding of what you can do actionably to start to improve your relationship.
Right, because that's the thing that people need to understand. There actually are things that they can do, which is why I have guests like you on the show, because it's like, we have this information. We just need to get it out there. And so I so appreciate your blog, the Gottmans, because it's treasure trove of information, and people can actually learn how to have great relationships. So can you give those websites again?
Yeah, so it's kylebenson.net, and then it's just Gottman, GOTTMAN.com.
Great. So, you know, one of my Leslieisms is that disagreements in a relationship are a given, but fighting is a choice. And I also say that couples should aim to hit the mark 85 to 90% of the time, because quite frankly, no one is perfect. But when we fall short and voices get raised and harsh words spoken, the damage done needs to be repaired. If it doesn't, the relationship becomes vulnerable. So getting better at all these steps is what's going to keep your marriage strong and healthy for the long haul. And after all, isn't that what you wanted when you said, I do? So hopefully you'll keep listening to the show, to great guests like Kyle. Keep getting information. And until next week, stay loving.